Go the Duggan! Good morning. My name's Terry and I'm the Shieldmaiden in the kitchen. Welcome back. If you've watched any of my other videos before, you know I'm a historian who specializes in Vikings. And today I'm going to make a nice dessert recipe that's very simple, but also I'm going to give you a little bit of information about an important alphabet that existed during the Viking Age. Some of you probably know it and maybe have guessed from the title of this video, what the Fuþark? Fuþark is a strange word, and it has a character in it that we don't have in the modern English alphabet, although it does exist in Norse alphabets, and it's known as the thorn. But this is referring to the younger Fuþark, which was the Runic alphabet that Vikings used from roughly the 8th century until about 1100. And so I'm going to cook a little shortbread cookie, and I'm going to imprint some runic characters from the alphabet on it so that you can kind of get a sense of what they look like. It comes from the alphabet that looks like this. And that is actually a derivation from an older runic alphabet that existed in the Germanic world prior to the Viking Age. But come along with me today, we'll make something sweet to eat and we'll learn a little bit about what it meant to write like a Viking. Okay, so what we're going to make today is a shortbread cookie, which is a really simple recipe, and it's something that I love because you can put it together really quickly. If you need a quick dessert or something just a little bit sweet to eat that doesn't take a whole lot of process or time or what have you, and it's just a few simple ingredients, and I really love the buttery, crunchy texture and taste of this recipe. And I have borrowed this from preppykitchen.com. I'll put all the information in the description as usual. But the first thing we'll need to do is get out your food processor. If you don't have one, you can probably use a general mixer, or you could even do this by hand. What the food processor does, though, is really quickly and easily get this dough mixture into the kind of crumbly shape that it needs to be in before we begin to shape it into bars. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll take, I've got here 10 tablespoons of unsalted butter that has been brought to room temperature. If you forget to bring it out and get it to room temperature, then you can also just sort of put it in the microwave for a few seconds to get it softened up. So put that in there. And then we want half a teaspoon of vanilla. And so I'm going to use this organic vanilla that I always use. And then we'll mix that up so that it gets creamed together just for a few seconds. And then once that's creamed together, I'm going to scrape down the side. All right. And then next we're going to put in half a cup of confectioner sugar. So not regular white sugar, also known as caster sugar, but actually powdered sugar or confectioner sugar. So that goes in next. And then we want to go ahead and incorporate that and scrape once again after that is gotten all mixed in. Okay, that looks like that's mixed in pretty well. And then we're going to add just a half a teaspoon of kosher salt. Dry this off. All right. And get that mixed in as well. And then the last thing we need to include is 1.5 cups of just regular all-purpose flour. So not bread flour or anything else. And I've never tried this with gluten-free flour, so I'm not exactly sure how that would work. But so just I have here just your standard all-purpose flour. And what you want to do is add this 1/2 cup at a time. So total of 1.5 cups, but incorporating it slowly, 1/2 cup at a time. You'll feel it already even starting to come together. Second one. And then one more. All right. And get all of that incorporated. All right, and that is all nice and mixed together really well. Let me get all this butter off my counter. And then you can see it kind of starts to come together in a very crumbly sort of mixture, but it also, as soon as you pinch it, kind of bring it together, it sticks together. And so that's exactly the consistency that you want. And so now we're going to dump it out onto a board and begin to bring it all together into kind of a ball and then kind of shape it. I dumped it out from my mixer here onto the board, and as you can see, I've begun to put it into this rectangular type of shape. When you first dump it out, it is a little bit crumbly, like I showed you what it looked like in the mixing bowl, but you just kind of continue to bring it together and incorporate it. It's got all that butter in there, and so there is some moisture that helps it to cling together, and ultimately you'll be able to work with it for a few minutes and get it into a shape like this. Now you might want to roll it out and cut it into various other kinds of shapes. I'm doing it in a bar form like this because I'm ultimately looking to make some little tile shaped cookies, just kind of rectangular tiles that are somewhere between maybe 1/4 and 1/2 inch thick. The last time I made this recipe, I did 1/2 inch, and that makes for a really good stout cookie that has a good crunch to it. And it's pretty dense. If you want something that's a little bit more delicate, then you can roll it thinner, maybe more towards the 1/4 inch size or such. And then, of course, we would adjust the baking time appropriately for that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I'm going to, just kind of keep working with this just to get it so that the edges are more sort of square and not rounded on the ends, and then that way it makes so that all of the cookies will be kind of a nice even size. And then once I'm finished getting this brick shape formed, I'll put it in some cling film, and then we'll put it in the refrigerator to cool for at least an hour. Because the chilling process will definitely get a chance for the butter to harden up, and then it won't be crumbly anymore when you work with it, and you'll be able to get a nice sharp knife through it really easily in order to cut the shapes that you want. So this is just about ready, and let's go ahead and wrap it in this cling film, and we'll put it in the refrigerator for about an hour, and then we'll make some cookies. Our brick of dough out of the refrigerator. It's been in there for just over an hour or so, and it has gotten nice and chilled and nice and hard, so it's going to slice up really easily. And I am going to go, I think, with about 1/4, maybe just over 1/4 of an inch thick slices on this so that I can get a fair number of them, because as you can see, this isn't actually a very big brick, so you're not going to be making a ton of cookies with this. And then I also have a couple of other tools as well. I'm gonna use this stick, which is just a basic wooden stick that you would use if you were making, skewers like kebabs or something like that. Because then I can use the end of it, both the pointy end and the kind of squared off end, in order to inscribe the runic letters into my cookies. And then I think I'm also going to try, I didn't do this before, but I think I'm going to try it this time to see if I can get things to show up a little bit better. I've mixed up some food coloring and just a few drops, equal number of drops of green and red, and then I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 drops for each, and then a couple of drops of yellow, because I kind of wanted to get a dark color, kind of a dark brown, which is what I have here. So, and then we'll see if I can't paint with my little paintbrush. This is what happens when you go to art school and you get all these extra supplies that you never use again because you didn't do anything with art. but you have brushes for kitchen use. So I'm going to use this tiny little brush and see if I can maybe paint on some of that food coloring and get the runic letter to stand out a little bit better than in the previous versions that I've made of this. And so it's just a matter of, again, taking a very sharp knife and slicing these off. If you've done any roll cookies like this before, you might also have seen that you can use dental floss. It works really well in order to get a nice clean slice. And so then get these, yeah, that's going through really easily. All right, and then I'm just gonna lay them on the cookie sheet as I slice them. And then that way I can work off of the sheet there when I'm doing the inscriptions of the alphabet. And now I mentioned this was going to be the runic alphabet that was used during the Viking Age, which is known as the Younger Fuþark. And so I showed you a slide there, but just as a reminder, here we go. This is the Younger Fuþark. And it is called Younger because it is a derivation of a previous Fuþark alphabet that was in existence in the Germanic world going back to roughly around the 1st century, so several hundred years prior to the Viking Age, and it was known as the Elder Fuþark. The Elder Fuþark has more characters, as you see, more letters in the alphabet. It has 24, whereas the Younger Fuþark around the beginning of the Viking Age in the 8th century was simplified down to 16 characters or 16 letters. And so you end up having some of those letters that double up and are the same kind of sound. And so it could be used for, more than one letter. So, a D and a B and a T can kind of be used, the same character can be used to indicate any of those letters or those sounds. So we get something that is a little bit simplified. And again, this comes from the Germanic Iron Age. And there were many Germanic tribes, even the Anglo-Saxons also used a Fuþark type of runic alphabet in the medieval period. And so the vertical marks that you see on these that make them actually easy to carve into things are known as staves, and it comes from the Old Norse word stafr, which is basically means like a stick or a pole. And so the staves then are, vertical, and then the other the other parts of the letter, as you can see, that come off of it generally are crossing it in some kind of shape or form or coming off of one side of it, but doing so mostly in straight lines. And so there's very few curved lines, if any, in a Fuþark alphabet. And it's believed that that is because of the ease of carving. And we're carving into things like wood and bone and metal during the Viking Age, or I should say not we, but they were doing that. And so you have, particularly when you're carving in something like wood that has a grain that you can go with it, then of course it makes it much easier if you're carving just straight lines and not having a lot of loops and circular shapes to it. All right, and so it's important to note also that the Fuþark was not used in the modern sense to write literature. The Vikings actually are living for most of the period of the Viking Age in what we would call a proto-literate oral culture. And that means that they did have this runic alphabet that they wrote on certain things, and there were definitely, kind of a stock type of writing that they did. They were inscribing on various objects, sometimes to indicate ownership. They were also, making memorials and things like that, but they were not writing literature, and they were not doing things like keeping accounts, writing administrative type books, or any of the other sorts of documents that we would normally think of that we use as primary sources as historians. It's not going to be until a little bit later in the Viking Age when Christianity comes to Scandinavia and the introduction of the Latin alphabet comes that the Vikings will then shift to, or I should say not Vikings always, but Scandinavian peoples, Norse peoples in the Viking Age, when they begin to use then, the written form in order to do more types of documentation that we would recognize as such in the modern world. So keep in mind, I mean, some of the purposes for which runes were used as far as inscribing goes, were for healing. And you can see that in these examples of runic letters being carved into antlers here. All right, so again, I mean, we're looking at things that are very much made up of vertical and, diagonal types of lines. And so what I'm going to do is just take the pointed end of this stick and begin to just kind of incise some of the letters onto the middle of these. So I'm going to start, my name is T, so I'm going to start with a T, which is just simply a vertical stave, and then a couple of lines off the top, which basically make it look kind of like an arrow pointing up. I mean, not kind of, it literally does look like an arrow pointing up. And so there you can see, that's a T rune. And then I think what I would like to try and do is use a little bit of this paint. And I'm gonna kind of paint down in those grooves. And we'll see what we come up with by the time this bakes. All right, so there you go. There's a T rune. And let's see, let's make, now what do we want to make? Let's make an M rune. So another long stave down the center, and then this time a couple of lines diagonal off the top that go in the opposite direction, just about, of what looks like an arrow. And so it ends up almost looking like a person with their arms up. All right, that's kind of, sometimes the dough gets a little bit soft, and so you kind of have to work a little bit quick. But so there you can see that kind of rune. So that's an M, or Madr. This is the other thing about the runic alphabet, is that each of the letters, it's not just a letter, but it actually has a corresponding word that is part of the meaning of the letter as well. So they are symbols as well as they are letters of the alphabet. And as I'm carving into these cookies, I'm just going to let you know, a couple of the uses for runes. As I mentioned, they were inscriptions, and the antlers that I showed you would have been used in healing. And the idea was to carve the runes into either the antlers like that, or sometimes bone, or even sometimes just, a stick, a wooden object. And then because Viking Age Norse peoples believed that the runes had been given to them by the god Odin, and of course Odin, you might know, is the Allfather. He's the primary, kind of the big guy, the big god. And because they came from Odin to human beings, then they are seen as being special and having magic powers. And so what they would do with the runes on these objects would be then to lay the object near a person or on a person who was ill in some way, or maybe who had a body part that was injured. And they believed in this kind of idea of transference, where the magic powers of the runes would draw the ailment out of the person, out of their body, and bring it into the piece of antler or bone or wood or whatever that it was inscribed on. And so that inanimate object actually took the illness out of the person. And so that was one way that they used runes. There were also other ways as well. Runes were carved into ordinary objects, like jewelry or combs or weapons, and most of them indicate some type of ownership, like you see in this brooch here.
The Hunterston brooch is a magnificent piece that was found in Scotland. It's a place that Vikings were known to have spent a lot of time. The brooch was made around the year 700, but the younger Fuþark runes that are inscribed on it were done a couple of hundred years later during the Viking Age proper. And here, as you can see, it has the very common type of inscription found on many Viking Age objects, runes that simply say, Melbrigda owns this brooch. Another way that runes were used was for carving onto stones that were raised in memory of someone. Most of these stones that survive are found in Sweden, like the ones seen here, but there are others across the Scandinavian and North Atlantic world wherever Vikings went. They were sometimes very simple, with just the runic inscription itself, and sometimes a bit more ornate, including pictures. Even into the period after Christianity came to the Scandinavian world, sometimes runestones would have a mixture of both pagan and religious Christian iconography. But the message was usually similar. The stone mentioned the name of the person who was commissioning it to be raised, and also the name of the person in whose memory it was being raised, including sometimes information about the deceased, such as aspects of their personality or the method of their death. But these were not headstones to be put at grave sites like we do in the modern world. They were put in very public places during the Viking Age so that many people would see them. Some of the most important runic memorial stones to survive are those found at the royal site at Jelling in Denmark. They were raised by King Harald Bluetooth in memory of his parents, Gorm and Tura. But they're also important because they document a bit of history, including information that suggests Harald unified Denmark and Norway into one kingdom, and also it was Harald who was responsible for bringing Christianity to the Danes. Some runic inscriptions have been found very far away from Scandinavia, such as this one discovered in the 20th century in the Church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, but which during the time of the Vikings was the royal city of Constantinople. Though the inscription is not entirely legible, scholars have been able to decipher enough to believe that it says something like Halfdan was here. So what you're looking at is a bit of Viking Age graffiti. Vikings traveled very far and wide in that eastern world, in what is now modern-day Russia and the Middle East, and we know for many years some Vikings were hired to serve as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard, which was the military regiment that was responsible for protecting the Byzantine emperor and his family. So here what we might imagine is that Halfdan was serving while the royal family was at religious services one day and simply got bored and decided to carve his name in the wall.
All right, and so we've got the majority of our runic tiles in place, and I'm going to make one last one. And this is not something that was known during the Viking Age, but it is known in our own modern time, and it is probably the most widely known around the world use of runic letters to create a symbol, and that is the symbol for Bluetooth. And some of you may know that the symbol that we have that links all of our technology together is actually something that comes from this runic alphabet, and it is a mixture of the H rune and the B rune, and that is for the Norwegian, or the Scandinavian king, I should say, Harald Bluetooth, who lived in the late 10th century. And so here we have our Bluetooth rune. What would it be without that? All right. And so then you can see here also these 6 characters here, F-U, Thorn, A-R-K. That's Fuþark. And so that's why we call it this alphabet, is because of the first 6 letters in it. And so I'm going to put this in the oven now, and I've got an oven that's preheated to 350 degrees, and we're going to bake it for roughly about 15 to 18 minutes. I'm going to check it and actually turn the pan, switch the pan around about halfway through to make sure that everything cooks nice and evenly. Here are our runic cookies fresh out of the oven. I think they turned out pretty cute. kind of a little funky, but that's okay. And so you see we have here across the top, F, U, thorn, A, R, K, Fuþark. And then of course we have the universal symbol now, Bluetooth, the combination of the B and the H runes, followed by the T, another version of R, L, M, S, and the H, a tiny little H on its own. So these cooked for a total of about 17, 18 minutes. And so I'm going to now go ahead and put them on our baking sheet so that they can get cooled off a little bit better. And I did rotate the pan halfway through, and so it might not take that long depending on how hot your oven runs or not. Again, this was a 350 oven, so just kind of keep an eye on them. What you're really looking for is, you know, the nice kind of golden that comes around the edges and on the back side. That's when you know they're really getting done. They are nice and they'll have a nice crispness to them, but they'll also be very dense and rich and buttery as well. And so there you have it. And this is actually a really adaptable recipe. I've seen people do some different types of things with it, as far as, you know, putting maybe some white sugar, sprinkling a little bit of it on the top right before you put them in the oven to bake to add a little extra sweetness. I've also seen people take them and dip one end into chocolate after they've baked in order to add a little bit of that kind of flavor to it. And then I think next time I do it, I'm planning on adding a little bit of lemon zest and lemon juice to the dough in order to, you know, add a little bit of a zing alongside the sweetness of the cookie. Although these are not too sweet, I should say. And so that's another thing that, you know, if you're a person who likes dessert, but sometimes maybe not stuff that's overly sweet, this is a really good all-around kind of cookie to make as well. And then again, if you change the thickness at all, I went for about quarter, maybe just slightly more than a quarter of an inch here today, and it took as long as it did. If you do a little bit thinner for a crisper type of cookie, then of course for sure watch the timing, because it won't take quite as long for it to get to that crispy golden brown doneness. All right, and so I hope you've learned something also about the runic alphabet that existed during the Viking Age. And I have mine with me always. I have my runic tattoo, which is, I have the thorn, R-I-K, and that is the Old Norse word threk, which is still a word that's used in Icelandic today, and it means endurance and perseverance and strength of mind. So for me, it is an appropriate Viking word to have with me always. And if you like what I'm doing here, remember to share and subscribe and like. And until next time, I'll bring you another recipe and some more interesting history from the Vikings. Sjáumst!